It was a time of shimmering art, delightful architecture, a time of fantasy, whimsy, unexpected twists, when philosophers who argued the interests of man joined with despots who pursued the interest of the state. The Enlightenment, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
Last time we ended with a philosophe. Remember 18th century philosophers, many of whom were infatuated with the reforming rulers of Central and Eastern Europe. The philosophers believed that what Europe really needed were philosopher kings, enlightened despots to bring innovations in political, religious, and educational practices, above all to make society more rational. And the movement that followed came to be known as the Enlightenment. Prussia's Frederick the Great was thought by Voltaire to be the nearest thing to a philosopher king in all of Europe, although the reality of Frederick's enlightened despotism was far less enlightened than the philosophers thought. And Russia's Catherine the Great was described by Diderot as having the heart of Brutus with the face of Cleopatra. Actually, she had the heart of Nero and the face of Mae West. But to Diderot, it seemed the perfect alliance. So the world got a splendid collection of his correspondence with Catherine the Great, who became great largely because of the publicity the philosophers gave her. And the same thing happened with Voltaire, who kept up a lively correspondence with Frederick the Great. It was a kind of a Renaissance relationship between men of letters who provided adulation and publicity, and rulers who provided them with gifts and subsidies and self-respect. But behind the relationships and behind the words, the reality was quite different. Privilege was not abolished in Prussia or Russia or any of the new states. On the contrary, the rulers had to rely on the nobles ever more because the nobles were the only class that was used to command. And so the rulers wound up giving nobles more privileges. In the Prussian army, for example, only nobles could be officers, a situation that went on with very few exceptions for at least 100 years. And serfdom was not abolished in Prussian and Russian and most Habsburg lands. The serfs were freed on royal estates, but not on the nobles' estates. And so, while the philosophers talked about freedom, what the enlightened despots wanted was not freedom, but regimentation and discipline. By the time Frederick II died, 4% of the Prussian population was in the army, even though his country was at peace. 4% of the American population today would give us something like 10 million soldiers. In Russia, Catherine the Great instructed her ministers to produce a constitution, had her instructions translated and circulated all over Europe to show how enlightened her country was, but nothing ever came of it. It was all like the trip she took through her dominions to see for herself how her people lived. Everywhere she went, she found clean villages with well-built houses, fat cattle, cheerful people, but the villages were actually stage sets. They were set up before she arrived. They were taken down to be reconstructed further along her route with the same cattle and the same caste of contented peasants. The man who arranged all this was Count Potemkin, Catherine's favorite and chief minister, and the villages with which he fooled the empress, and I suspect she wanted to be fooled, these villages were called Potemkin villages, a term for empty, misleading show, and a technique still used today. Catherine's constitutional reforms were also false. Empty fronts. And when Catherine's philosopher friends reproached her with this, she answered, "It's easy for you to talk, you write on paper. I write on human flesh." In other words, it's easy to recommend improvements when you sit in your study. It's harder to produce change in real life. But was that really the difference between her and the philosophers, or was it something else? In truth, the alliance between philosophers and enlightened despots was based on a misunderstanding. The philosophers were interested in man, his progress, his dignity. Their despotic friends were interested in the state, its interests, its power. Both believed in treating people as individuals, but for very different reasons. When the despots treated people as individuals, it wasn't because they believed in the dignity of man, but because it was to the advantage of the state. It was easier to deal with a dust heap of separate individuals than with corporations and estates and other bodies with a collective personality and collective power. So where to the philosophers the equality of the individual before the law was a principle, to the rulers it was a means to eliminate the diversity of interest groups that made governing difficult. But even with this misunderstanding, the alliance lasted because it was also based on interest. The philosophers got respect and money and favors. The despots got useful publicity agents. And the misunderstanding was founded on distance as well. When Voltaire finally went to Berlin, when Diderot traveled to St. Petersburg, the reality was considerably less attractive than the dream. But as long as they stayed in Paris, it was easy to believe in the new societies and their enlightened despots. In the 18th century, Russia and even Prussia were, to many people, impossibly far away. Of those philosophers who actually went to see for themselves, some saw only Potemkin villages and were fooled. Some were disappointed with what they found. Others were bribed or slandered. But most of the philosophers were just men who wanted to believe in something. They were surrounded by inequity and injustice at home, and the real abuses that they saw around them made them ignore, made them forget, made them dismiss the much worse abuses that took place in these utopias far away, which they wanted to regard as the promised land. So the Enlightenment was very limited. The states of the enlightened despots were modernized. They were dragged out of the Dark Ages into something a little less dark. Life in the dominions of Prussia and Austria did improve in some material respects. And the state machine and the military machine became competitive with the West. But you have to put it in perspective, and you have to remember that the enlightened despots were always more despotic than they were enlightened. They were also exceptional. as you can see from the example of Germany, or rather, the Germanies. At this point, the Germans were hardly a nation. They had no sense of national identity. The Holy Roman Empire in which they lived was neither holy, nor Roman, nor really an empire, just a congeries of states. Any unity the empire ever imposed was purely formal. The Germans were divided among 200 or 300 states, and 10 times as many autonomous sovereign entities, some of them no larger than a large ranch in Texas, 80 of them less than 24 miles wide. It was the old feudal structure preserved with dukes and counts and margraves and bishops and abbots and princes, all claiming their absolute right to rule over their little bit of land. Every ruling family claimed absolute power. They kept their position by playing the King of France off against the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna, and as the 18th century progressed, they fell more and more under French influence. Travel through Germany today and you'll see that every other town has its palace copied from the French, and probably a romantic annex like the hamlet Marie Antoinette had built at Versailles, with a dairy and a rustic cabin and a fake grotto or two. But while fashion and conspicuous consumption were copied from the West, little else was. Nor did the conspicuous consumption of the German states mean sophistication or good manners. Here was the very antithesis of the ideal of order and refinement that lay at the base of the Enlightenment. At the court of Prussia, for example, when the footmen rattled the plates at dinner, King Frederick William, Frederick the Great's father, was quite likely to whip out his pistols and shoot at their wigs to set them on fire as a punishment. And there is a description of a dinner which the Archbishop of Mainz gave in the late 18th century to his fellow electors, the princes who were symbolically the managing committee of the empire. A dinner that lasted from midday until 9 in the evening, and while they ate, a military band provided constant music. When they had finished eating, the electors, led by the court-martial, danced on the table until they fell under it. You might say that it wasn't really safe to dine with a German prince, and the princes who were also bishops were the worst. Partly because they liked practical jokes like water spouting from the seats, or dishes or glasses with holes in them. Partly because they grew the best wines in Germany and drank them, of course. At every meal, the Prince Bishop of Münster used to empty in one draught a large silver church bell full of wine, and he expected every one of his guests to do the same. Between meals, hunting was the rule. Almost every crowned head of the time loved these killing sprees. It was the only exercise they got, after all, apart from running after women or after boys. And furthermore, since each territory was considered by its ruler as his own private estate and hunting preserve, agriculture was nearly brought to a standstill. It isn't very surprising that quite a number of these princes were on the verge of madness, impotence, alcoholism, or over the verge. They were also great collectors, and their collecting was obsessive. The Duke of Württemberg collected 4,000 different editions of the Bible. The Duke of Brunswick collected vast numbers of harpsichords and spinets, the best of which he reserved for the use of his favorite cats. Another prince decided the time of day according to his own convenience. The clocks of the state had all to be set according to the hour which he chose for his own library. And the Duke of Merseburg spent all his income on furnishing a large room with every kind of bass viol presided over by an immense double bass which was so big it could only be played from a high stool with the aid of a bow as long as a mast. So you can see that the Enlightenment didn't reach very far, and you can see why the subjects of the more backward rulers envied those people who lived in lands like Prussia, let alone France. And you can understand also why even the very limited reforms of the enlightened despots could come as a relief to their subjects at a time when most rulers were really drunken, incompetent tyrants. And yet these boorish clods lived in palaces, worshipped in churches, applauded in theaters that were epitomes of grace. The style of the 18th century is lighter, daintier, wittier than that of any other age. It's what we call Rococo, and it originated in France, where people were tired of the pretentious grandeur of 17th century classicism. When Louis XIV died in 1715, this ushered in a revolt that had been brewing for a long time against the stateliness and the restraints he had imposed. Imagination, grace, comfort took over, at least for the well-to-do, and they created a world on which crude life impinged as little as possible. Furniture grew softer and less massive. Dress for men and women got lighter and brighter. What people wanted now was not strength, but sensibility, not ponderousness, but pleasure. And so solemnity went out, elegance and fantasy came in. Probably the most interesting French patron of literature and the arts was Madame de Pompadour, who was the mistress of Louis XV. It was Pompadour who protected and helped the writers who put together the monument of 18th century thought that was the Encyclopedia. And it was Pompadour who patronized painters like Boucher, who characteristically painted her holding a book. Color, freedom, delight, enchantment are the hallmark of 18th century painting. The enchanted exuberance of Boucher, the enchanted theater of Tiepolo, the enchanted mirages of the Guardi brothers, the enchanted flippancy of Fragonard. You can see this best in the work of the most representative painter of the 18th century, Jean-Antoine Watteau, with its delicacy and charm, its superficial relations, its shimmering colors. There's nothing solid or eternal about the people and the scenes he paints. They're here to enjoy themselves in a trip, in a game, a picnic, a dance. Their relations are fragile because pleasure is fragile and transitory, and so is life. It's interesting that Watteau's best-known painting, The Embarkation, takes a traditional theme, which is a pilgrimage, and transposes it to a frivolous level. The pilgrimage to Jerusalem becomes the pilgrimage to Cythera, the island of love. Here, a group of ladies and gentlemen are embarking for Cythera, and Cythera shimmers across the water like a sort of Jerusalem, just as enchanted, but profane. And the whole scene is highly theatrical, which is another characteristic of the Rococo and of 18th century society. Rococo gardens, for example, were artificial recreations of nature with artificial waterfalls, ruins, and a wilderness, as they called it, that made gardens into picturesque places for dreaming and rambling. Gardens have always tried to recreate nature, but those of the 17th century had been stately, orderly creations. No shadow, no mystery, just straight beds, grand alleys, vast vistas. In the 18th century, however, you get irregularities, a whimsy, unexpected twists. And this was also reflected in a contemporary fad for exotic things. Turkish fashions, anything outlandish. There was more trade overseas. And the ships that went to the Near East and to China brought back a lot of things now that looked different. And since they looked different, they looked attractive. They looked vaporous. They looked frivolous. They fitted the contemporary protest against the old formality. Like gardens, Rococo fashions were as elaborate, as artificial as possible, from the wigs and bows and baskets to the completely useless little shoes. The more useless, the more anti-functional, the better. And this appreciation of the ephemeral in everything is especially evident in music. What, after all, could be more ephemeral than music? Not the notes printed on paper, but the performance, which in that time could not be captured or preserved. Music is the typical happening, and music was the model of 18th century art. It fascinated Watteau, who often painted himself as a musician. It fascinated his contemporaries. The 18th century was the great age of music, or perhaps music was the great art of the 18th century, especially elegant and witty music, as epitomized by Mozart, who died in his mid-30s, just like Watteau. Even Rococo architecture looks musical. Rococo architects built theaters and opera houses designed so that the public could enjoy each other even more than what was going on the stage. And opera houses went on being built in Rococo style for 200 years. And they built churches that looked like opera houses, where churches of the past were mysterious, awesome. Rococo churches are a garden of delight. There's no trace of counter-Reformation hellfire. There's no trace of Puritan sobriety and restraint. Joy has replaced fear. Scenery has replaced ritual. Display has replaced inspiration. It's all stucco and gilt and curlicues and a lot of mirrors to reflect the light. God himself is a delight, and you expect the priest to burst into an aria. Now, history doesn't pay much attention to pleasure, and frivolity is not a favorite of scholars who are made of sterner stuff. But you should remember that the lighter and softer sensibility of the Rococo period also went with greater sensitivity. Sensitivity not just to our own feelings, but to the feelings of others. More and more members of the upper classes did not want their feelings bruised. And so they didn't want to see pain or suffering, which were, after all, standard aspects of contemporary life. And it was the more sensitive people of this age, like Madame de Pompadour, for example, who began to curtail torture and public executions and the repressive and cruel legislation that had survived for centuries. It was people like these who welcomed penal reform in the last third of the 18th century, or at least who welcomed campaigns for penal reform that tried to fit punishment to crime and to social utility, rather than to age-old horrors like cutting off a hand for stealing a loaf of bread. Some called for reform because they were enlightened, and I shall talk about that next time. But a lot of people wanted or accepted reform simply because their taste had changed, their manners, their feelings had become more humane, they were more sensitive. And if you do good for selfish reasons, that's all right too.